Hello there, this is Dr. Jenkins. Some call me Dr. J from the YouTube channel I Teach Statistics and Stuff. Today's topic is going to be research design. Okay, going to break down some basics here. So as a researcher, you're going to start with a question. So let's say that my example question is, I want to know more about the streaming habits of millennials versus Gen X. If you don't know millennials, even though it's debated, typically millennials include people who were born in the mid 80s to late 90s or early 2000s. And then you have people who are the Gen X, and that's typically you were born between the years of 1965 and 1980. That's me, Gen X. Perhaps you are a millennial. Let's find out more about the streaming habits of these two. All right, so in terms of research design, what it is it's a framework. People sometimes get so carried away or so excited that they get far into a research project without even considering what's the appropriate framework. And if you don't set up the appropriate framework, as the statistical saying goes, garbage in, garbage out. Or if you don't use the right framework, the data that you do get, you're not going to be able to really make heads or tails of it. So this is really important. So in determining a framework for a research question, there's really two important considerations. The first of which is it going to make sense to do a quantitative versus a qualitative research design? And really, this refers to the type of data that you are interested in collecting and the nature of your question. Once you establish that, if you're doing a quantitative study, then it's a question of, is it going to make sense for me to do a non-experimental design versus an experimental design? I'm more of a quantitative kind of gal, so that's going to be more of my focus. Other people are have much more expertise in the qualitative. Okay, so I want to make a point here. Research design is different from the statistical tests. Once you get into statistics and once you get it, it's so cool. You want to run an ANOVA, you want to run a regression, you want to run a MANOVA, you want to run a t-test, all those things. But really, that's your second question. That's what you're going to be working on later. It's so much more important at first to pick the research design to match your question. And that is a completely different can of worms than statistical tests. So it's much more important to start with what design makes sense. And then once I choose the appropriate design that makes sense, per a given research design, there's going to be a series of statistical tests that I can use. And you go from there. But our first question, of course, is the research design. All right, so we can see here, as I mentioned, the first question is really qualitative versus quantitative. I like tables. You're going to see tables. Perhaps on my headstone on my grave, it's going to say, don't make any more tables. But I like it for a summary standpoint, and it really breaks it down. So again, quantitative versus qualitative. Really, of the many considerations, the two that are probably most important would be the type of data that you're interested in working with and the nature of your question. We're going to break these down one by one. I know you're excited. Hold your horses. Okay, so the purpose. The purpose of a qualitative study design, research design, is more about trying to understand a social phenomena. Maybe in terms of my research question about streaming habits of Gen X versus millennials, if I was interested in a qualitative aspect, I'd be more interested, this is a TV streaming online is a more recent phenomena. So maybe I'm interested in how do people who are a little bit older, the Gen X, take on this recent technology compared to the millennials. Maybe the millennials are more willing to take it up because they're more technologically savvy. This would be more of a qualitative versus a quantitative. A quantitative, the purpose, I'm looking more about cause and effect or relationships between variables. So if I'm doing quantitative, maybe I want to see, relationships between variables. So really my basic question could be, how does age influence How does age influence number of hours spent streaming online TV? Okay, so the purpose, that's going to shape what kind of research design you choose. And then the reasoning is very different. For a qualitative study, this is inductive. Inductive means that you're working from making observations and then from those observations trying to generate a theory, versus deductive, you have a theory, you test it, and you see what you get. Let's look at a picture here, and I'm going to use my pen, see how I do with this. For qualitative, it's more inductive. So inductive means I'm making a bunch of observations. So all these things here, my fancy drawing is certainly helping. I'm making all these observations. I'm looking at this age group, that age group. I'm looking at these habits, that habit. So I'm making observations. And then from those observations, I'm generating my own new theory. That's inductive. You're creating a theory from a bunch of observations. You can hear my cat in the back. I'm not sure what she's getting into. Versus quantitative. Quantitative means that you have a theory already in mind. So in quantitative, I already have my theory. So for example, I might say, let me change the color of this. As a Gen X person, I'm having a little trouble myself. There we go. Let's try it again here. Oh, much better, right? So for quantitative, I have my theory, and then I'm going to put it through a test to see if my theory turns out to be shown to be true in that case, yes or no. So instead of the qualitative, which are kind of working from a bottom up, make observations and form a theory, in quantitative, I'm working from the top down. I have a theory in mind, and then I'm going to see whether or not that theory turns out to hold any water. I know this might sound kind of boring, but it's really important to think about your question. And that's just going to help you down the way make better decisions about your research design and make the data that you get much more valuable. So this is really important, even though you may not want to be listening to me right now. Okay, so in addition to the purpose and the form of reasoning, qualitative and quantitative are also different in what kind of data we use and then what kind of statistical analyses we're going to end up using. In qualitative, there are no numbers. Numbers are out. Let's see if I can get my pen to work again. So in qualitative, you're working more on themes or stories. So if I was going to ask my research question about streaming habits of millennials versus Gen X, I'd be working on themes. There's themes in these generations. And how do these themes of these generations relate to hours spent watching TV? Maybe some of the themes could be things like access to technology. That's a theme that could be different between Gen X and millennials. Maybe I have a theme versus just how the culture has changed, you know? Maybe for millennials, the culture is much more revolving around streaming and TV and things like that versus the Gen X are maybe more likely to read a book. And then quantitative, as the title suggests, quantitative is numbers. I always think about the N. If I look at the N in quantitative, it reminds me that I'm using numbers. And this is really my jam. So you'll get to know I'm much more comfortable with numbers. It's just much more how my brain works. But this is not to say that quantitative is any better than qualitative. We need both. All right. So for quantitative, we're going to get numbers. I'm going to have a theory. Maybe my theory is that, my hypothesis or theory is that the millennials watch more streaming TV. That's my hypothesis. And in deductive reasoning, I'm going to create a statistical test to test that theory using numbers. I'm going to get two groups. This group has 50 people in it. This group has 50 people in it. I'm going to make observations, and in a deductive way, I'm going to use numbers to see, is there a statistically significant difference between these groups? And can I somehow bring that back to the cause being the differences between the generations? All right, okay. Other differences. In qualitative, we tend to have smaller sample sizes. If you think about qualitative, you might be doing things like focused interviews. If I really want to create themes in inductive, I got to ask a lot of questions, and that takes time, and therefore you tend to have a smaller sample size. Versus quantitative, if I have a theory that I want to test, the greater sample size I have, the greater power my statistical test is going to have. So sample size, usually you want larger and quantitative when possible. And then instead of doing a focused interview, you're going to actually have a pre-experimental, experimental, or non-experimental study design. Okay, so those are the basics. If I go back, here's our chart, because I love charts. You can really see a nice side-by-side comparison. And like I said, this is important. So I know it's not the sexy stuff. The sexy stuff is running your ANOVA and pressing the button and seeing, ooh, was it statistically different or not? But you cannot get there in a meaningful way without really thinking through your study design, your research design. So I encourage you to really spend some time on this, and this can help you form a better question. Okay. So as we're going to move forward, as I told you, quantitative is really my jam. I'm a numbers kind of person. And when we talk about quantitative study designs, if I go back for a second, we're going to be covering 3 different study designs: pre-experimental, experimental, and non-experimental. And one way of helping us understand how we're going to set up these quantitative studies is by using a standardized notation. Our good old friends, Campbell and Stanley notation. You're going to learn to love them. Probably not, but it's a really good tool to help us just really think about what we're doing. In this notation, we use different letters to demonstrate different things. R, if you see an R anytime, here's my example on the bottom right. R means randomization. And what we're going to find is that some study designs that are quantitative involve randomization and some don't, because sometimes you can randomize and sometimes just with the nature of your question and the data you're collecting, you can't. So if you see an R, that dictates, that tells you there's random assignment. We're always going to see some observations. That's what we're doing in a quantitative study. We're making observations. Sometimes you'll see a little subscript number. Like on the top here, it says randomized observation 1. That would be just telling us that that was one particular group, that we did one observation. So maybe we did our first observation here, then we did our second observation here. Let's see if I can cross these off here, because now we can't see what I'm going to talk about next. And that would be a real shame now, wouldn't it? Okay. Treatment or exposure, sometimes they're used interchangeably. So you might see an X for exposure to an event, or you might see treatment. And they can be used sometimes interchangeably. Technically, they're a little bit different. If I'm doing a study where, let's say I'm going back to my example of streaming habits of millennials versus Gen X, if I want to have exposure of a group to an event, maybe I would expose one group to education on how too much TV watching impacts education level or something, or a better way of saying that would be too much TV watching can have poor impacts on health because you're less likely to be outside working out or something. That would be more of an exposure. One group I expose them, X, to this educational session. One group I don't. Or it could be a treatment. If you're doing a study where you're looking at the effects of a certain stretching program on incidence of muscle strains, that might be more of a treatment versus an exposure. So you might be more likely to see a T. But either way, you're likely to see a T or an X here. We do our first observation, we apply a treatment or an exposure. Usually to one group we apply it, the other group we don't, and then we observe again. As we go through the research designs and quantitative, I'll be giving the Campbell and Stanley notation for each, just to help us better understand. Okay, we're going to take a little break here, and I'm going to come back for part 2.